right, hello everybody. So I'm going to go ahead and cover Chapter 3, which has to do with genetics, conception, fetal development, and reproductive technology. I feel like it would be easier to record Chapter 3 than it would be to do 1 and 2. I'd rather cover those in person with you guys. So let's get started. Genetics. So you guys should know the word genetics. What are the important aspects of genetic testing? And usually when I ask these questions, I give you guys some time in class to answer them. So feel free to pause here, answer the question like you would in class, and then we will go over it. So what do you think are the important aspects of genetic testing? Really, genetics are done to prevent diseases and abnormalities, right? If we can detect abnormalities that can be fixed or prepare people for the possibility of certain genetic diseases, they are better prepared for when baby comes or as the infant grows up. We kind of are prepared for it. It also helps us study these things to prevent it in the future, find treatments, find ways to prevent this from happening. What is the difference between genetics and genomics? So it's important to know genetics are the composition and function of a single gene. So when you see the word genetics, think we're looking at one gene, one abnormality on one gene. If you're looking at genomics, you're looking at the bigger picture. This is all the genes and their relationships to one another, how they work together. So remember, genetics, one, genomics, the entire system, the whole DNA sequence. All right. Dominant versus recessive traits. I'm sure you guys kind of remember this. We started learning about this kind of stuff back in high school. So dominant genes are going to be expressed over recessive. In order for a recessive gene to be expressed, what do you need? You need 2 recessive genes, right? Because the dominant is always going to be expressed over the recessive. So if there's a dominant in play, that recessive is never going to be shown. So most genetic diseases are related to defective recessive genes, okay? You can have, if you have 2 recessive genes that are defective, it's going to be present at birth. Sometimes if it's one, they will show it. Generally, not often. So just think of it this way. If they have 2 defective recessive genes, they're going to see it at birth. If they have just 1 defective recessive gene, they're generally just going to be a carrier of that specific trait. There are some genetic diseases exampled in table 3-1 in your book. Mainly, your big ones are like sickle cell, Tay-Sachs disease, and hemophilia, which they do check for all of these during prenatal testing. They also do genetic screening on newborns 24 hours after they are born. All right, sex-linked inheritance. What does this mean? So if it's sex-linked, it has to be connected to either the X or Y chromosome. The mutated gene is located only on the X chromosome, or it can be the Y. The gene can either be recessive or dominant. Male children who receive an X chromosome with a mutated gene present with the disorder when the Y chromosome does not carry that gene. The gene, even though it may be recessive, becomes dominant. Why do you think that is? Well, that's because men only have 1 X chromosome. So if that X chromosome is mutated, they're going to present with it. Female children who have 1 X chromosome with a sex-linked trait disorder do not present with the trait, but are carriers. Why is that? That's because they have 2 X chromosomes, right? And we said the dominant is going to be shown over the recessive. So they're going to be carriers. With Y-linked inheritance, the mutation is located only on the Y chromosome, which means only it can be passed from father to son. I hope that makes sense to everybody. Okay, genomic testing. So they have this thing called the Human Genome Project, which is a lot of scientists on board, basically providing diagnosis, treatment, and prevention of genetic disorders. They are studying the genomics, the whole thing. They're looking at the whole DNA sequence, looking at indicators for diagnosis of certain diseases, treatment, how treatments are affecting the genome, and prevention of how these disorders can come about. Some examples of genomic medicine would be the newborn screening. This is what I had just mentioned a second ago. We send off blood to the state lab. It is a state mandated test to babies born Usually it has to be done around 24 hours of age. It is sent off and it looks for any markers in their genome that may make them more likely to have certain genetic disorders as they get older. They look at DNA biomarkers for cancer. They look at pharmacogenomics, how medicine and treatment plans are affecting, and development drugs. In the early stages of making new medicines, how they affect the DNA sequence, how they affect all these mutated genes. Genetic testing, we have carrier testing, which is basically just checking if they're a carrier for a certain disorder. This is a good indicator. A child will have it if both parents are carriers of a certain genetic disorder, right? If they have one recessive gene that has mutations on it and they both give those recessive genes to the child's going to have two recessive genes showing this abnormality. They can also do pre-implantation testing, which detects genetic changes to embryos before implantation. So this is for your in vitro babies. Once they converge everything, they look at all the genes, the genetic makeup of everything to make sure it looks like it's compatible with life before implanting. Prenatal testing, early detection for any genetic disorders in the baby. This can be done for a lot of different disorders. They can test the amniotic fluid. They do standard prenatal testing, but there's a couple that if anything is off at any point during the pregnancy that they can add to it to look for some of these genetic disorders. And then the newborn screen can also test for some genetic testing. So if you ever see a red box on a screen, it's usually pretty important. So what puts couples at higher risk for conceiving a child with a genetic disorder? What's considered a geriatric pregnancy is anyone over 35. If they have previous pregnancies with genetic disorders, one or both partners have a genetic disorder, and a family history. So that's to not put them at risk. They're probably going to end up getting more testing than the average person because they're at higher risk of these things. So sorry, y'all. I am at home, so you might hear some of my dogs decide to bark in the background. Anyway, moving on to teratogens. So what do you think teratogens are? Teratogens are drugs, viruses, infections, or other exposures that cause fetal development abnormalities. Most at risk is the first 8 weeks of gestation, which makes it kind of difficult because there are many women who do not know they're pregnant the first couple weeks and put themselves at risk of teratogens unknowingly. So what exactly happens depends on the factors at play. So it depends really on how much they were exposed, what exactly it was, how concentrated that exposure was. There's many different factors included. There's a table 3-2 in your book that kind of goes into different teratogens and what they might do, but don't focus too much on memorizing the different teratogens, just the big ones, such as alcohol, ACE inhibitors, cocaine, warfarin, chickenpox, rubella, syphilis, and Zika. There is such a thing called toxoplasmosis. I don't know if any of you have heard of it before, but it's really a parasite found in cat feces and unclean or uncooked meat. So if a patient that just found out she's pregnant has a cat, you want to make sure they avoid cleaning the litter box, trying to make sure they stay away from that cat feces, and making sure they eat cooked meat, and clean meat as well. So sometimes uncooked burgers or steaks can have this teratogen in it as well. Now this doesn't cause any illness to a person that's not pregnant. So it's important to educate that it's not something that you have to stay away from long term just while you're pregnant. All right, so just to reiterate the different models, so are back to our A&P. So we have the male. So remember, in the fetus, the testes develop near the kidneys and drop into the scrotum before birth, usually right before birth. And it's important to make sure both testes are in the scrotum when a newborn comes out who happens to be male. Just to remember exactly where everything is, okay? Our A&P for our females. Again, if you guys don't know your A&P, I would go back and just refresh your memory on the A&P of the male and female anatomy and exactly how some of this stuff occurs, okay? Remember, in a female, fertilization occurs in the fallopian tubes, and then that fertilized egg will travel down into the top of the uterus where it will be implanted into the wall of the uterus. Okay, so remember where these things take place, because sometimes when some of these issues arise, it's important to know where these issues could be taking place. All right, moving on to the ovarian cycle. So we start with the follicular phase. This is the first of the 14th day, or you can think about it as starting on the day 1 of the menstrual cycle, the period, and it ends with ovulation. And this is the maturing of the follicle in the ovary. Estrogen is going to rise, causing the uterine lining to thicken, basically getting ready for that implantation of the egg. And they may experience increased energy and focus. Typically lasts about 13 to 14 days, though it can range depending on hormone levels. And then we move on to the ovulation phase, which begins when the estrogen peaks, and it ends with the release of the egg from the follicle, which is the ovulation period. Once ovulation is over, we're into the luteal phase, which begins after ovulation and lasts around 14 days. If implantation occurs, high levels of progesterone and estrogen will stay up. If not, then we will start to see a decrease in progesterone and estrogen, starting the menstruation cycle, basically cleaning everything out and starting over again. All right, and then we have the endometrial cycle, which basically, while the ovulation cycle is happening, we are looking at the endometrial cycle as well, which is the endometrium inside of the uterus. So you're going to see many changes in the endometrium based on the hormonal changes. So first you have the proliferative phase, which is basically right after menstruation. So we have regrowing and thickening of the endometrium in prep for that implantation. And it ends with ovulation. Then you go into your secretory phase, which is going to basically continue to severely thicken that endometrial layer, increasing blood supply to the area and thickening of that cervical mucus. Basically, that is the phase where the endometrium is fully ready to keep that implanted egg where it's supposed to be. It occurs right after ovulation and ends with the onset of menstruation. And then you have your menstrual phase, which is the sloughing off and expulsion of all that tissue. Like I said earlier in the previous cycle, you are in these last phases, in this menstrual phase, everything's sloughing off. We're starting brand new to start that proliferative phase, regrowing all that tissue back. All right, oogenesis and spermatogenesis. So it's basically the formation of a mature egg regulated by your follicle stimulating hormone and estrogen, and then spermatogenesis is the formation of mature sperm regulated by follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and testosterone. Okay, so I really just put this in here to try to make sure you remember what hormones are regulating what within the body when it comes to this aspect of implantation, fertilization. All right, conception. Conception is when sperm enters the nucleus of the egg. You also have fertilization, which occurs in the fallopian tube, like I said earlier. So those are two different terms that mean two different things, remember. So what needs to happen for fertilization to occur? You basically have to have everything where it needs to be, right? The layers in the endometrium need to be perfect. You have to have an egg in the fallopian tubes ready to go, and the sperm have to make it to the fallopian tube. So sometimes that cervical mucus can help it get where it needs to go. Once fertilization occurs, then immediately the cell division begins. And then you have implantation, which you have heard me say many times already, which is embedding of that fertilized egg into the endometrium of the uterus, which usually occurs in the upper part of the uterus. But it can occur anywhere, but you will have more issues in pregnancy sometimes, depending on where exactly it implants. I did put in a YouTube video here It's kind of funny. It's the intro to an old movie from the 90s, and it kind of just helps you visualize exactly what needs to happen for fertilization to occur. Don't worry, it's not anything inappropriate. So give that a watch and let me know what you think when I see y'all next in class. Then we have embryonic and fetal development. So implantation, I cannot say that word today, has happened in the upper part of the uterus. We're ready to go. So next we have an embryo. You will start to have organogenesis, which if you can break the word down just means development of body organs. They develop an ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm, which there's a table in your book that goes into depth about this. And then it develops into a fetus. The developing is referred to as a fetus from week 9 all the way until birth. Okay, and they go more in depth with table 3-4. I don't want you guys to memorize these tables. I put them in here kind of to help you understand certain aspects if you don't remember them. But just know that yes, this PowerPoint isn't super long for chapter 3 because you have many other chapters on this exam. You have 1, 2, 3, 18 and 19. 18 and 19 are your well women's and problem with women's health. So those are your big chapters if you're wondering, because I know some of you are like, this is not a very long video. And that's kind of why. I would just want this to be a basis of how pregnancy happens, the A and P of the male and female anatomy, and kind of moving on from there. Making sure you know what genetics and genomics means. Anyway, back to the PowerPoint. And then you have fetal circulation. So the cardiac system starts to develop actually very, very quickly. The heart can actually begin to beat during the 3rd week after conception. Most women will not know they're pregnant at this point. They are going to obtain oxygenated blood through the placenta. So now we have a whole other organ, in a sense, that's going to help with the fetal and maternal side of circulation. So the placenta, it's both fetal and maternal tissue. You have your chorionic membrane, which is the fetal sides, and the cotyledons, which is the maternal side. If you've ever seen a placenta, you can see both sides and how they look different. It's pretty interesting. I really hope you all get to see one. It's actually where the tree of life picture has come from, because it kind of looks like all the branches of the arteries in the placenta. And then you have your placental membrane, which separates the maternal and fetal blood. So people always think, oh, mom's blood goes in there, mixes, and goes into baby. Their blood actually doesn't fully mix, and you don't really want it to mix because baby and mom can have 2 different blood types. But this placental membrane allows for exchange of gases, nutrients, electrolytes, and so on. It's a critical function of the placenta. But some other critical functions, what could you think of? We have metabolic and gas exchange, hormone production. So it's really important to maintain that. So a couple of things with the hormones. So you have progesterone, that the mother will be having high levels of progesterone and estrogen, right? Progesterone is going to decrease uterine activity, basically keep it calm. So if a mom has good levels of progesterone, that means her placenta, her uterus is going to stay nice and calm. We're not going to contract early. We're not going to go into preterm labor. Estrogen is going to stimulate the enlargement of the uterus, help the uterus grow, and allowing the baby to grow, right? And it's going to cause the breast to grow as well. You have your HCG levels, which shows how the placenta matures over time. That's why it rises. So when a woman's checking a pregnancy test, they're actually just checking an HCG level. Okay, it's a really, really long word. You'll see it in your book. But you could just call it HCG. That's what I'm going to call it. That's what you'll see on your exams as well. HCG, the higher it is, the more mature the placenta is getting, the more stable the pregnancy is. Okay. And in human placental lactogen, your HPL, promotes fetal growth by glucose control and prepares the body for lactation. So those are some of the hormones that are going to be at play while all of this is developing. All right, and here's a picture from your book. I really, really like this picture. It kind of shows you the different maternal versus fetal circulation area. Down here at the bottom, it's a really nice the myometrium, endometrium, and chorion. So it shows you the maternal and the placental, the fetal part of the placenta. along with the umbilical cord, the umbilical vein, and the umbilical arteries. So we're going to get there, but remember your umbilical cord on these babies, they will have one large umbilical vein and 2 umbilical arteries. Red flag, my little red boxes, like I said earlier, make sure you know these. Certain medications can cross the placenta, so it's always important to consult a physician before taking anything. There's a lot of regular medications, such as ibuprofen, which is factual, that it can cause some fetal abnormalities early on. That's why many women are educated to take Tylenol during pregnancy for pain and for other reasons, such as fever and things like that. All right, embryonic membrane. So what makes up the embryonic membrane? You have your amniotic sac, which is formed by the amniotic and chorionic membranes. Okay, you could always Google what an embryonic membrane looks like, and it'll kind of show you a little bit better than these words. But the amniotic sac contains the embryo and the amniotic fluid. It's a big old sack full of fluid and the baby, okay? Maintains a sterile environment for the fetus and keeps out bacteria from the vagina. So if mom has a GBS, which you'll learn a little bit later, if she has that, everything is okay. The baby is protected as long as the amniotic sac is intact. Once the water's broken, then we're not in a sterile environment anymore, and any of that bacteria can get up through to the fetus. Okay, amniotic fluid is clear. You want it to be clear and a watery consistency. It contains proteins, carbs, lipids, electrolytes, fetal cells, lanugo, and vernix. Okay, so a lot of different things. It cushions the fetus from maternal movements. Oh, by the way, remember that lanugo is going to be fetal, very thin hair. That's what they call the hair that's like on the baby's shoulder sometimes, lanugo. And then vernix is white, waxy, some people call it cheese. It's that white, waxy substance that babies have born on their skin as a protectant. All that's found in the amniotic fluid. But it protects the baby from maternal movements. When mom laughs, hiccups, anything like that, it's like being in a big old ball of water. So it kind of cushions the baby from everything. This also protects mom during labor. So you'll see a lot of women, once the water's broken, their contractions become a lot more intense because now they're contracting onto a hard body and not a water bubble. So you'll see that becomes a lot more intense for them. It allows free maternal movement, and the baby is now in a, like we said, it's in the amniotic sac full of fluid that is temperature regulated to match mom's temperature, so it helps the baby with their temperature regulation as well. So 2 vocab words to learn are polyhydramnios and oligohydramnios. Poly is an excessive amount of amniotic fluid. I put some numbers on there for you. It increases the risk of chromosomal disorders, cardiac, GI, and neural tube defects, which you will get a little bit into with Miss Hart's content. Oligohydramnios is decreased amounts of amniotic fluid, less than 500, usually related to decreased placental function. Basically, the placenta is just not super strong. It's kind of weak, or it can be an older placenta, and increased risk of renal problems in these babies. You'll see a lot of oligohydramnios babies also have, they're typically smaller, on the smaller side, because they just don't have as much fluid, as much room to grow. And your polyhydramnios babies are also at higher risk of having their umbilical cord come out, which is a umbilical cord prolapse. That can cause a lot of issues during labor. You have to immediately take some pressure off of that, because remember, the umbilical cord is how baby's getting oxygen. So if that's kinked like a water hose, baby's not getting oxygen, we're having some issues. But again, you'll get more into those with Miss Hart's content. I just wanted to touch on it now, so now at least you know what it is. All right, getting into the umbilical cord I had kind of talked about earlier. Well, this is a good picture of the amniotic sac and the fluid and the placenta. So you can see that part at the top that makes it not such a perfect semicircle. That's the placenta. That's where all that stuff is going to happen. That's where the cord's going to be connected. You can see the umbilical cord kind of in the middle. You can see on here really how much everything's being squeezed down. You see why the bladder is usually a lot smaller at this point, being pushed between the symphysis pubis and the baby. That's why you see a lot of pregnant women say they have to pee every 30 minutes. That's why. All right, and then to protect the cervix and where the baby's at, there is a mucus plug that the woman typically will have to pass before everything else happens with the baby. The mucus plug is on the outside of the amniotic sac. It's not in there with baby. It's just kind of another protective layer there. Okay, so the umbilical cord connects the fetus to the placenta. It consists of 2 arteries and 1 vein, encompassed with Wharton's jelly. So I don't know how many of you have felt an umbilical cord yet, but it's very gummy, very much like Jell-O, honestly. And that's what the Wharton's jelly is. It's just very protective. It's kind of different in these babies. So the arteries are going to carry deoxygenated blood, and the vein is going to carry oxygenated blood. Typically, the umbilical cord is about 55 centimeters long, but you can have cords that are longer and cords that are shorter. Shorter cords are at higher risk of breaking during labor because the doctor will have to, during the delivery, once the baby comes out, the mom has to deliver the placenta next. And if the cord is super short, sometimes it's just not long enough to come out effectively. So they can cause some issues with that. And you can't just pop a cord because that's where all of mom's blood is going to try to get to the baby, right? To help the baby get oxygenated. So there's a lot of factors there, but it's generally 55 centimeters long. Once the baby is born, you want to assess the umbilical cord, make sure all 3 vessels are there. So you want to look for the 2 arteries in the vein, ensure that everything looks how it's supposed to. And typically they will take blood from the umbilical cord as well, to do any blood tests that they might want to do for the baby, such as ABGs and a blood type. Sometimes the Wharton's jelly is super, super thick. Sometimes it's not too. You'll see a bunch of different variations this semester as you go through clinical, but it doesn't really matter how much Wharton's jelly there is as long as those 2 arteries and 1 vein are there. All right, moving on to infertility. This might be a hard topic for some of you, so just warning, okay? But infertility is defined as the inability to conceive after 1 year of unprotected intercourse. Typically, most OBs in the area will say try for a year. If nothing happens, then we'll start infertility treatments, or they will be referred to somebody else, or they'll start doing testing to see what exactly is going on, what's not happening. So there's many different causes for infertility, such as autoimmune disorders, diabetes, poor nutrition, risky behavior. I mean by that illicit substances, significant alcohol, many sex partners, STI diagnosis, things like that. History of cancer or chemo treatment sometimes will definitely cause infertility. Hormone imbalances, right? Because we talked about a bunch of hormones earlier. If the estrogen and progesterone, things like that aren't perfect, and the testosterone in the male, then we might not get it. Environmental pollutants, age, obesity, and smoking. How do we diagnose the infertility? We have to figure out what's going on. What's happening? So of course we want to do some STI screenings to make sure that's not the cause. We want to look at our hormone levels, do a semen analysis. We look at ovarian reserve testing. Are you even ovulating, right? Many women have a menses cycle. However, the actual act of ovulation doesn't happen. Because remember, women are born with a certain amount of eggs in their ovaries from birth. They don't get any more. They don't lose any less until they just start coming out with each menstrual cycle. So it is possible that some women run out of eggs early on in life. And they might do a hysteroscopy, to just get in there and look around and see what's going on. You'll see a lot of women get diagnosed with endometriosis. They'll see a lot of scarring, things like that, in that tissue, finding blockages and things as to why for infertility might be the reasoning. Okay, so then treatment. How do we fix it? Well, we have to first know what's causing it to fix it, right? So if it's STIs, we need to definitely treat those. Give it some time, because a lot of STIs like gonorrhea and chlamydia will cause significant scarring. HPV, things like that. If it's hormones, we can do hormonal therapy. If we can fix the hormones, generally we can fix the infertility. Maybe some lifestyle changes, changing some of the risky behaviors, changing the nutrition, losing some weight maybe, stopping smoking. Corticosteroids sometimes will help with getting pregnant. It just kind of helps with some of the hormone levels. It helps with the pHs as well. And then we could do drug therapy like Clomid, which can help with sperm development. And in women, it can induce ovulation who don't regularly ovulate. Like a lot of your women with PCOS, or sometimes the hormone imbalances with FSH and LH, Clomid can help kind of regulate all that. And then we can also do surgery to help with the infertility. All right, emotional implications. So there are many different emotional aspects of infertility, right? So they call it a roller coaster of emotions. There's a lot of different feelings. We could have stress, anxiety, guilt, low self-esteem. You can see a marital strain, which sometimes, you think like, oh, well, that must just happen at home. No, it doesn't. Sometimes these emotions come out right there in the office when the conversation's happening. So you have to make sure you are not picking sides. You are not blaming one person over the other, because you really don't know. It could cause sexual dysfunction with the pressure of trying to fix the infertility, and it could be a lack of support. A lot of people don't like to talk about this kind of thing with random people, right? So they might not have the best support, best family network to work them through this. For example, I had a patient not too long ago, actually, who had her first baby from IVF. So she was super excited about it. And one of her family members was sitting in the corner bragging about how she's like fertile myrtle, she called it. And she's like, I had like 8 or 9 kids, and kind of went on about this whole thing about how many kids she's had. And I could tell from my patient's face that she was getting aggravated with that, because she's had to work really hard to get the baby she just got. So again, like, sometimes that conversation needs to change a little bit, and sometimes you have to facilitate that. So it's important, as the nurse taking care of these people, to give them the resources they need. So sometimes you can offer them couples counseling. Sometimes social services can help with that. Give options to consider and how to handle the emotional aspects of it all. So there's another table 3-5 in your book that kind of goes over the different options that they can consider. They can consider adoption, things like that, but you don't want to jump to that. You can jump to other treatment options, IVF, things like that might help get them through this really difficult time.